Hey, it's Casual Jake, and today I am bringing you an EDH deck tech. Today we are diving into my brew around one of my favorite uncommon legendaries, and that would be Quintorius Field Historian. Now this is a mid-power artifact themed deck that aims to win through combat damage from our created spirits or with a little artifact based combo. Now before we jump into the rest of the deck, allow me to take a moment to do the YouTube thing. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. You can also leave a comment telling me your thoughts on the deck and even offer suggestions for cards to include or future commanders to brew around. All of these little interactions really help small creators like myself and help my content reach more and more people. I really appreciate all who take the time to help out this channel. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and discuss this deck.
History is always written wrong, and so always needs to be rewritten.
I felt this quote by Spanish-American philosopher, poet, and novelist George Santayana perfectly encapsulated the beliefs of the College of Lorehold, to which Quintorius, the commander of our deck, belongs to. Lorehold is one of the 5 colleges at the Strixhaven University, which can be found on the plane of Archaeologist. The Lorehold College focuses on history and the knowledge and wisdom we can gain from the study of it. Lorehold mages use their magic to commune with spirits attached to ancient artifacts to get first-hand accounts on historical events. This is shown mechanically in the game, with Lorehold cards being focused on graveyard interactions and on spirits. Quintorius plays into both of these themes by not only buffing our spirits by +1/+0, but by also creating a spirit every time one or more cards leave our graveyard. Notice the ability reads "leave your graveyard," meaning it can trigger whenever a card is reanimated or even exiled from the graveyard, which is a distinction that this deck will take advantage of. The basic play pattern of this deck is as follows. Establish an early means to fill our graveyard. Find one-time and or repeatable means to reanimate or exile cards from our graveyard. Use the spirits created for combat-based wins, or assemble an infinite combo to win the game all at once. Now that we have a general idea of the deck and its play pattern, let's dive into the individual cards that bring this deck to life. Now make sure you are taking notes, because there will be a quiz at the end of the term. Oh goodness, teacher humor, am I right? Like most decks in Commander, we are going to want to ramp early in the game so that we can access our payoffs as the game proceeds. Similar to prepping for a test, the more time we spend setting up, the greater the payoff will be when we are out in the hot seat. We run staples such as Talisman of Conviction, Mind Stone, Wayfarer's Bauble, and Soul Ring. We also pack some newer and more unique tech with Archaeomancer's Map, which allows us to put 2 basic planes into our hand and play them whenever an opponent with more lands plays their land drop. We also run Keeper of the Accord, who checks our opponent's end steps to see if they have more creatures or lands than us. If that opponent has more creatures, we get to create a 1/1 soldier. If they have more lands, we get to search for and put a basic planes onto the battlefield tapped. This card is perfect in helping us keep up with our opponents who have an easier time accessing land-based ramp. Now that we have our ramp in place, it's time to get digging so we can fill our graveyard with plenty of artifacts to excavate later. Lorehold Excavation has us mill a card in our end step. Then if that card was a land, we gain 1 life. Otherwise, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. For 1 red and 1 white, this is a perfect early play to start filling our graveyard with cards and has an activated ability that can be useful in the late game. For 5 mana, we can exile a creature from our graveyard to create a tapped 3/2 spirit token. And if we happen to have our commander out, we can also trigger them to create a 2nd spirit token. And we call that Value Town. Oh well. Anyway, we also run Perpetual Timepiece, which, side note, is a Casual Jake personal favorite, but also lets us tap it to mill 2 cards from our library. We can also pay to and exile the timepiece to shuffle any number of target cards from our graveyard into our library. This will only result in 1 activation of Quint's, and yes, I do call them Quint's ability, but it helps us protect ourselves from getting milled to death. Codex Shredder works similarly, but only mills 1 card from our library when tapped. We can also pay 5, tap it, and sacrifice it to return a card from our graveyard to our hand. This ability allows us to, again, trigger Quint's ability, but can help us return a key card we might have milled to our hand. Then we have Millikin, which ramps us while filling the graveyard. When we tap Millikin, we put the top card of our library into the graveyard and add 1 colorless mana. We also run cards that have us replacing cards in our hand while also filling the graveyard. Faithless Looting is a classic that has us draw 2 and discard 2 cards and can even be flashed back later. And before you raise your hand and ask, yes, flashback does trigger Quint's ability. And speaking of looting, Deal Broker has a bunch of text that is absolutely irrelevant because we are not drafting it. But the text at the bottom, that allows us to tap it and draw a card and discard 1 is perfect for sifting through our diff site. I mean library. We also have Thrill of Possibility, which has us discard a card first to then draw 2. Thrilling Discovery works similarly, but has us discarding 2 to draw 3. Oh, and for extra credit, we gain 2 life. We also run a few mass discard spells that restock our hand when we just don't have anything useful in hand. Heartwarming Redemption has us discard all the cards in our hand, then we draw that many cards plus 1. We then gain life equal to the number of cards in our hand. This card has helped me toss absolutely helpless hands and replace them with cards I can actually use to progress my game plan. Illuminate History allows us to discard as many cards as we choose and draw that many cards. This allows us to keep the cards we want and replace the duds with potential gas. But once this effect resolves, the spell checks if we have 7 or more cards in the graveyard. If we do, then we get to create a 3/2 Spirit token. Both of these spells offer great card selection with decent upsides. We only run 1 Planeswalker in the deck, but their abilities make them worthy of this coveted spot. Daretti Scrap Savant has 3 loyalty abilities, with each benefiting our game plan. Their +2 ability allows us to discard up to 2 cards and draw that many. Their -2 ability has a sacrifice an artifact to return target artifact from the graveyard to the battlefield. And lastly, their ultimate or -10 ability creates an emblem that states, whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of your next end step. While it is insanely difficult to get to this last ability in a game of Commander, we may be able to get there with a wall of spirit tokens defending our Planeswalker. Now that our yard is full, let's discuss some cards that benefit from either entering the graveyard or benefit us just by being there. First, I'd like to mention all the spells with flashback ability, as they can be cast from the graveyard for their alternate casting cost. This helps us get value from them if we accidentally mill them or we just want to cast them twice. These cards include the aforementioned Faithless Looting, as well as Prismatic Strands, which is a value-packed fog effect, and Savine's Reclamation, which lets us return a permanent with mana value 3 or less to the battlefield and can be flashbacked for extra value. Next, we have Anger, who is a creature that gets us value just by being in the graveyard. If Anger is in our graveyard and we control a mountain, then all our creatures will have haste. This allows for turns where we make multiple spirit tokens and are able to immediately use them for value. Crashing Drawbridge is another card that gives our creatures haste if we tap it to activate its ability, but unlike Anger, this card has to be on the battlefield. We also run Scrap Trawler, which many know as a combo enabler, and don't worry, we will get to that soon, I promise. Scrap Trawler reads, whenever Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. At the least, it allows us to return certain artifacts to our hand when artifacts are destroyed, and it's most powerful, it can be part of that infinite combo loop that we'll discuss later on. In either scenario, this card offers insane value in our Artifact Reanimator deck. And we can't forget about the unforgettable, the unkillable, no seriously, in canon this character is blessed, or some say cursed with immortality. That would be Squee the Immortal, who can be cast from our graveyard and even from exile. There's no getting rid of this little guy, and that means we will always have a card to cast from the graveyard to trigger Quint's ability. Now, we have already covered a few cards that get other cards out of the graveyard, but in this section of the video, I'd like to dive deeper into the topic. Daring Archaeologist lets us return a target artifact from our graveyard to our hand when it enters the battlefield, plus we place a +1/+1 counter on them each time we cast a historic spell. And so we are all on the same page. A historic spell is a spell that is either legendary, a saga, or an artifact. Ameria Shepherd is an angel that has a landfall ability. The landfall ability reads, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If that land is a plains, you may return that non-land permanent card to the battlefield instead. Now, with the amount of plains that we are playing in this deck, there is a good chance that many of the landfall activations will be returning permanently straight to our battlefield. Similarly, we also run the land Ameria, the Sky Ruin, which enters the battlefield tapped but has a great upside. It reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 7 or more plains, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Again, we are playing so many plains cards that it is very common that we will have enough plains to meet the requirement of this ability on most upkeeps. Then we have a commander classic in Sun Titan, who lets us return a permanent with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield when the Titan enters the battlefield or attacks. Incredible ability aside, having a 6/6 vigilant beater ain't too shabby either. Karmic Guide is another creature that is a 2/2 flyer with protection from black. It is also an angel spirit, so it does get pumped by Quintorius. But that's not the main reason we play this card. We play this card because when it enters the battlefield, it allows us to return any target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. We do have to either sacrifice Karmic Guide or pay its echo cost on our next turn, but even if we don't pay, getting back a single creature is well worth the cost. We also run another famous or infamous creature in Goblin Engineer, who lets us search our library for any artifact and put it into our graveyard when they enter the battlefield. Then by tapping the Goblin and paying 1 red mana, we can sacrifice an artifact, then return target artifact with a mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. This little gobbo lets us not only tutor a potential artifact reanimation target, but gives us the means to get it onto the battlefield if we are willing to scrap one of our other artifacts already on the battlefield. At this point, we have covered how to fill the graveyard and get cards to leave the battlefield to create spirit tokens with Quint's ability. From there, you can make judgments on when and who to attack. But combat damage isn't always viable, so we have some built-in combos that can either produce us a massive number of tokens or create loops that can just win the game. I like to start by talking about Bag of Holding, which was a card that flew way under my radar until I constructed this deck. Bag of Holding reads, whenever you discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard. Then, for 2 mana and a tap, we can draw a card and discard a card, or for 4 mana and a tap, we can sacrifice the bag and return all cards exiled with the Bag of Holding to our hand. While we appreciate both of these activated abilities, it's the static ability that can allow us to do some shenanigans. For example, let's say that we have a Bag of Holding and our commander on the battlefield and then cast Heartwarming Redemption. Each card we discard will trigger the bag separately, meaning each card we discard will individually be placed into the graveyard and then exiled, triggering Quintorius for each card discarded. This can result in us making 4, 5, 6 and onward tokens with a single spell. And even if we don't have a mass discard spell, our looting effects on Deal Broker and Faithless Looting will still yield us spirits. We also play Teshar Ancestor's Apostle, which is known to enable a few combos, but the floor for this card is still insanely valuable. Teshar reads, whenever you cast a historic spell, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is an easy way to reanimate value creatures that might have died or been milled earlier in the game, but can also enable combos with Scrap Trawler. An example combo would involve Teshar, Scrap Trawler, Blasting Station, and Urza's Bauble, all cards we run in the deck. To initiate the loop, we sacrifice the Bauble to get it into the graveyard. Then we use the Blasting Station to sacrifice Scrap Trawler and deal damage to an opponent. When the Scrap Trawler dies, we return the Bauble to our hand. We then cast the Bauble, triggering Teshar, who brings our Scrap Trawler back to the battlefield. This will trigger the Blasting Station to untap, and the loop can be initiated until we can eliminate the entire table. The Blasting Station is the key here because the loop requires a creature sacrifice outlet to get the Scrap Trawler into the graveyard. That being said, the Blasting Station can be replaced with an Ashnod's Altar to produce infinite mana, or you could replace it with an Altar Dementia to sack the Trawler, thus milling our opponents to their demise. Again, these combos can be complex and I still have a hard time understanding them. Feel free to rewatch this segment of the video if you want another go around with it. I'll timestamp the loop in the description as well as leave a link to a website that highlights all of these combos. Now, you might also notice that with all these cards leaving the graveyard, a Teshar loop will also produce infinite spirits if Quintorius is on the battlefield, and you would be correct. But you can also initiate a loop without a Teshar present thanks to Quintorius' ability. You do have to replace Teshar with another piece of tech, but as I mentioned, we are running all of these mentioned cards in the list. For this combo, you need to have Quintorius, Blasting Station, or one of the other sacrifice outlets we mentioned, Urza's Bauble, and a card we haven't talked about just yet, Salvaging Station. Salvaging Station allows us to tap it to return a non-creature artifact from the graveyard to the battlefield and untaps whenever a creature is put into our graveyard from play. And I can see some of the gears turning for y'all. Some of you may see the combo, but allow me to run through it. With these cards in play, you sacrifice the Bauble, though the loop still works if the Bauble is already in the graveyard. You then use Salvaging Station to return the Bauble to the battlefield. This will trigger Quint, creating a spirit that can be sacrificed to the Blasting Station. When the spirit dies, it will untap Salvaging Station, and the loop can be initiated again and again and again. Each time the Bauble is reanimated, it will create a spirit untapping the Blasting Station, which then sacrifices the token to untap the Salvaging Station. Like a well-oiled machine, this combo can, like the Teshar combo, deal infinite damage, produce infinite mana, or mill out our opponents depending on which sacrifice outlet we have available. While these are completely viable combos that I have used personally to finish out the game, they are not the main focus of the deck. While I usually stumble into the combo in the late game due to the amount of pieces required and lack of tutors in the deck, I still advise speaking to your playgroup about the possibility of these combos occurring. Let's all be civil and keep these pregame discussions constructed and uplifting. But if you do find yourself in a position where your only possible out might be a combo finish, I have also included a card that will help us churn through our deck like no tomorrow. Underworld Breach is another card that is synonymous with combos and in this deck has many advantages. Again, I like to start by assessing a card's minimal impact, and at its least this card can help us cast spells from the graveyard while exiling others to activate numerous Quintorius triggers, which, if our graveyard is large enough, can provide enough value to win the game on its own. I have also used Underworld Breach to recast Jeska's Will multiple times, with Jeska's Will ideally creating 3 or more mana if an opponent has the right number of cards in their hand. If my graveyard is full enough, this has allowed me to recast and dig with Jeska's Will until I exile and cast my combo pieces. Regardless of when you cast it, in most situations, Underworld Breach is an absolute bomb in this deck that really benefits from our self-mill plan. The last category I want to highlight in this deck is a little more flavor than function, but that doesn't mean that these cards can't do both. With Quintorius being an archaeologist who travels the world searching for lost artifacts while exploring ancient ruins and underground excavation sites, it's fairly easy to compare him to the iconic Indiana Jones, whose famous line, "That belongs in a museum," inspired the title of this deck. To feed into this theme, I have included some cards that reference the film franchise that give this deck a sense of whimsy, and I really personally enjoy it. The card Bag of Holding is a reference itself, referencing the satchel that Dr. Jones carries on their adventures. Coveted Jewel is a 6-drop artifact that draws you 3 cards when it comes into the battlefield. You can then tap the jewel for 3 mana of any color, but it also reads whenever 1 or more creatures an opponent controls attacks you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. Untap it. That means this card could be passed around the table and incentivize players to continuously utilize the attack step. But I can think of something else that was coveted that led its seeker to their demise, the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, it's a bit of a play on words and it doesn't fit one for one, but I felt the idea of an artifact that is seeked by many only to lead to their untimely demise fits this card very well. Pit Trap is an artifact that reminds me of some of the booby traps Dr. Jones has to face when exploring the ancient ruins, and also acts as a removal spell if an opponent chooses to attack us with a non-flyer. Lastly, we have Grinning Totem, which looks very similar to the golden idol found in the iconic opening sequence of the first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Film references aside, this card lets us pay 2 mana, tap and sack it to search our opponent's library for any card. We then set that card aside and can play that card until the beginning of our next upkeep. If we don't, the card goes to our opponent's graveyard. Now, we do have to cast the chosen card for its original casting cost, so if our opponents aren't in the same colors, we might just have to go steal a land or a colorless spell such as an artifact. But if they are playing red or white, we can sometimes use this card to get a silver bullet removal spell if need be. Like Indy himself, we are always ready to think on the fly and ready for any adventure.
A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots.
In this quote, Jamaican political activist Marcus Garvey explains the importance of knowing one's past in order to be rooted in who we are today. Now, I usually like to end my deck text with a little insight on how a deck personally affects me, and this one is no different. Upon researching Quintorius, I found him to be a very similar character to myself. I had always had a love for history, and before I discovered my calling to be a music teacher, I was convinced that I would study and become a history teacher. I would spend days after a history assignment was completed at school, digging deeper and deeper into the subject to get every piece of knowledge I could that we just didn't have time for in class. I then learned that Quintorius is attending Strixhaven on a scholarship, but like many other students, myself included, needs to supplement the remaining tuition by working while maintaining their full class load. Like many college students, I held a part-time job throughout my university days just to afford the cost of living and school supplies, and like many others, I am still in a massive amount of student debt. But Quint's hopefulness and drive to bring history to life, his conviction to uncover the lost city of Zantafar, the lost city of his people, inspires me whenever I sit down to play this deck. I'll leave a link in the description to the article that tells Quintorius' story, as well as a link to a dramatic reading of the story produced by Voice of All, which is a YouTube channel that regularly does incredible audiobook-style recordings of MTG lore. I hope this video has given you some insight into Quintorius Field Historian as a commander, and maybe even inspired you to build a Quintorius deck yourself. My full deck list is in the description, but as always, I would love to hear what cards you think should be in the deck down in the comments. And while you're down there, I do hope that you would consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you want to catch more deck techs and commander gameplay in the future. I understand these things take a little time and effort, but they greatly impact my channel and help this content reach a wider audience. Your support is always greatly appreciated. Lastly, I want to thank my incredible editor, Busted Sleeves, for all their hard work in bringing this video to life, as well as the incredible voice acting talents of my friend, Joeseph Johnson. You may know Joe from his YouTube channel, I Hate Your Deck, or from one of his commercial spots on television, but if you know him, you know he is one of the most kind, humble, and talented persons that you'll ever meet. He was such a joy to collaborate with, and you can find his and Busted Sleeves socials in the description. In conclusion, class, I hope you have enjoyed your time here. I'm Professor Jake, head of all things casual, reminding you... Wait, the bell doesn't dismiss you, I do... Oh well, see you next class, and don't forget to play your land drops!